Welcome to our video on the social and cultural consequences of imperial cities, which flourish through wars and strategic alliances. Today, we won't just focus on the battles or political treaties that marked the rise of these great centers of power. We will explore how daily life, culture, architecture, and even religious traditions were transformed by the context of wars and alliances. In this video, we will highlight the profound impact that these events had on different social classes, from the nobility to common peasants. Cities such as Constantinople, Venice, and Baghdad are often remembered for their military and diplomatic power. However, what is often overlooked is how these conquests shaped the lives of the people who lived in these places. Today, we will take a closer look at these impacts, going beyond the battlefields to dive into the social and cultural effects of these imperial dynamics. Daily life in imperial cities. How did wars and alliances affect the daily lives of citizens in these imperial cities? To understand this, imagine living in a city like Constantinople at the height of its power. The inhabitants lived surrounded by seemingly impenetrable walls while the empire's military forces fought to expand and protect its borders. But how did this situation affect the everyday life of a peasant family or an urban craftsman? In times of war, the city was on high alert. Young men were often recruited into the army, and their families, in their absence, faced a scenario of uncertainty. Furthermore, war directly impacted the supply of food and goods, as many products came from regions outside the city. If trade routes were blocked, it could cause inflation and shortages, directly affecting the common population. On the other hand, in times of peace, often guaranteed by successful diplomatic alliances, cities prospered. Markets buzzed with products from all corners of the known world, from spices from the east to fine fabrics from the west. The population experienced a constant flow of cultural influences, resulting in a cosmopolitan and diverse society. Venice, for example, not only prospered economically due to its alliances with foreign powers, but also became a cultural melting pot. The city attracted merchants, artists, and scholars from across the Mediterranean and beyond, shaping the cultural and intellectual life of its inhabitants. This shows how alliances and diplomacy directly affected people's lives, providing them with rare prosperity during peaceful times. Impact on social classes. Now, let's explore how different social classes were impacted by these historical events. The elite and nobility were undoubtedly the greatest beneficiaries of alliances and military victories. Many of the alliances made between imperial cities and other states were secured through diplomatic marriages between noble families. These arrangements not only consolidated political and territorial power, but also ensured that wealth flowed to the most powerful families. Merchant elites, especially in cities like Venice, also flourished due to these alliances. Venice was one of the largest commercial centers in medieval Europe, and its merchants controlled vast trade networks that extended from the Mediterranean to the east. Strategic alliances with other city-states and kingdoms secured safe trade routes, allowing a steady flow of goods and wealth. For Venetian merchants, the peace brought by alliances was essential for the growth of their fortunes and social status. In contrast, peasants and common workers generally bore the brunt of wars. In times of conflict, they were often forced to enlist or provide tributes to support the war effort. Harvests, interrupted by looting or the conscription of men, resulted in famine and economic instability for the lower classes. The role of peasants is often marginalized in historical narratives, but it is crucial to remember that these classes represented the foundation of the economy. Society in Constantinople, for example, the nobility dominated much of local politics and commerce, while peasants faced daily challenges to survive. However, a successful diplomatic alliance could, in many cases, temporarily improve the situation for peasants, bringing security and trade to the city. Cultural and religious consequences. Now, let's delve into the cultural and religious consequences of these alliances and wars. Imperial cities often became centers of a phenomenon known as cultural and religious syncretism, where different traditions and cultures merged. This was particularly evident in cities like Baghdad, where Persian, Arab, and Byzantine influences mingled. Political alliances and commercial exchanges facilitated this blending of cultures, leading to a cultural richness that often shaped the identity of these cities. Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate. During the Abbasid period, Baghdad was the intellectual center of the Islamic world, and its alliances with other kingdoms allowed for the exchange of knowledge, especially in the fields of science, philosophy, and medicine. The result was a period of cultural flourishing known as the Islamic Golden Age. Religion as a political tool. Furthermore, religion was often used as a tool to legitimize alliances and wars. Rulers justified their military campaigns as divine missions, while religious alliances consolidated political power. One example is the relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the Orthodox Church, where the emperor's power was closely tied to religion, and alliances were often sealed with the Church's blessing. In contrast, religious minorities often faced amid difficulties these alliances and conflicts. If an alliance favored one religion over another, minorities could be marginalized or even persecuted. This was the case for many Jewish and Christian communities living in cities dominated by Islamic empires, or vice versa. Architecture and monuments. The architecture of an imperial city was often a direct reflection of its military conquests and diplomatic alliances. Many cities used their monuments and fortifications as a way to display power and wealth. Walls of Constantinople. The famous walls of Constantinople, for example, were a clear demonstration of the Byzantine Empire's military power. These fortifications not only protected the city from invaders, but also symbolized the empire's ability to withstand constant attacks over the centuries. This sense of invulnerability was crucial for the morale of the city's inhabitants. On the other hand, successful alliances often resulted in the construction of monuments and churches that commemorated peace or celebrated joint victories. St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, for example, is an example of how architecture could be influenced by cultural alliances. The basilica, with its blend of Byzantine and Western styles, reflects Venice's position as a bridge between East and West, a direct result of its political and commercial alliances. Artistic and literary influence is another fascinating aspect of the cultural consequences of wars and alliances, is the way they influenced the art and literature of imperial cities. These cultural expressions not only reflected military triumphs, but also revealed the complex cultural interactions that arise from diplomatic alliances and contact with other civilizations. Art as political propaganda. Many imperial cities used art as a form of political propaganda. Rulers commissioned large murals, sculptures, and tapestries that glorified their military victories and strategic alliances. These works of art served to reinforce the power of the ruling elite while inspiring pride and loyalty among citizens. For example, in Rome during the imperial period, military victories were celebrated through triumphal arches and columns that told the story of the empire's conquests. These monuments not only celebrated victory, but also served as visual reminders of the emperor's power and authority. External cultural influences, however, diplomatic alliances also introduced new artistic influences. Venice, for example, is a great example of a city that assimilated artistic styles from various cultures through its commercial and political alliances. The city was famous for its trade with the Middle East and North Africa, which brought stylistic influences from the Islamic world into Venetian architecture and decorative arts. We can see these influences in the mosaics and geometric designs found in St. Mark's Basilica, which echo Byzantine and Islamic artistic traditions. Similarly, cultural alliances between the Islamic world and medieval Europe had a profound impact on the Renaissance of the arts and sciences in Europe. During the Caliphate of Cordoba in southern Spain, the coexistence of Christians, Jews, and Muslims led to a vibrant exchange of artistic and intellectual ideas. The Greek literary and philosophical works, preserved and translated by Islamic scholars, were reintroduced to Europe through these cities, directly influencing the Renaissance period. Literature and war narratives. Literature was also deeply influenced by imperial wars and alliances. In many societies, chronicles and epic poems celebrated the military feats of great heroes or kings. These works were often commissioned by the ruling elite and served both to glorify their victories and to consolidate their legitimacy. In medieval England, for example, Froissart's chronicles detail the battles and alliances of the Hundred Years' War between England and France. These accounts not only provide a detailed view of historical events, but also shaped how future generations would understand these conflicts. Epic poetry was also a powerful tool for exalting the deeds of an empire. In the Byzantine Empire, works such as De Gennis Acritas, a medieval Greek epic, celebrated the feats of the Byzantine frontier guards, the Akriti, who defended the ire against invaders. These heroic stories, often involving alliances with neighboring tribes or the defense of imperial cities, served to inspire pride and loyalty among the Byzantine people. Family power structures. Diplomatic marriages, a crucial aspect of maintaining and expanding the power of imperial cities, was the strategic use of diplomatic marriages. In an era when political alliances were often sealed through marriages, these arrangements played a vital role in the political stability and growth of cities. Marriages as tools of alliance. In many cases, marriage was seen as the most powerful tool for ensuring peace and prosperity between rival nations or cities. Rulers of imperial cities frequently arranged marriages between members of their families and those of other powerful houses to consolidate alliances, prevent conflicts, and secure the loyalty of former rivals. For example, the Habsburgs, one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe, used marriage as a strategy to expand their empire without the need for military conflicts. The famous phrase, "Let others wage wars, you, O happy Austria, marry, Bella Geranalii, tu Felix Austria nube," reflects this philosophy. Through diplomatic marriages, the Habsburgs accumulated vast territories and political influence across Europe, often without resorting to arms. The role of women in the diplomatic game. Noble women played a central role in this system, often serving as political pawns. By marrying princes or foreign kings, they carried with them the promise of peace and cooperation between their respective countries. However, many of these women also managed to exert significant political influence in the courts to which they were sent. Isabella of Castile, for example, was a central figure in strengthening the alliance between Castile and Aragon, culminating in the unification of Spain. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon not only brought political stability, but also resulted in an era of imperial expansion for Spain. However, these marriages could also be a source of instability. If relations between families deteriorated, alliances could be broken and wars could break out. Furthermore, in many cases, foreign wives were viewed with suspicion by local populations, which could generate tension in the courts. Changes in social and economic structures beyond the direct impacts on diplomacy and politics, alliances and wars also caused profound changes in the social and economic structures of imperial cities. Economic impact of wars, although devastating, often led to the development of local economies. During conflicts, imperial cities often required large quantities of supplies, from weapons to food, to sustain their armies. This created opportunities for merchants and craftsmen, who benefited from the demand for military products. However, this prosperity was often temporary. When wars ended, the local economy could suffer from decreased demand and increased taxes to pay for war costs. Additionally, defeated or besieged cities often faced periods of famine and economic desolation, as the surrounding agricultural lands were destroyed or looted. The rise of the bourgeoisie, another significant result of alliances and war, was the growth of an increasingly powerful merchant class. In imperial cities, especially those with vast trade networks like Venice and Genoa, merchants played a central role in the economy. Thanks to strategic alliances that ensured the security of trade routes, these merchants accumulated immense wealth and, over time, began to wield political influence. In the case of Venice, merchants not only enriched themselves through trade, but also took control of the city's government, establishing a mercantile oligarchy. This governance model, where wealth was directly proportional to political power, became a central aspect of many Italian city-states. However, the rise of this new bourgeois class created tensions with the traditional nobility, which saw its power diminish as merchants gained more influence. This tension between nobility and bourgeoisie was a common feature in rising imperial societies, shaping internal politics and, in some cases, leading to social conflicts. The transformation of religious structures. Religion was always a powerful force in imperial societies, influencing not only the personal lives of inhabitants, but also the politics and alliances between kingdoms and cities. Wars and strategic alliances profoundly and lastingly shaped the religious landscape of imperial cities. Religion as a tool of political legitimacy. In many imperial cities, religion served as a tool to legitimize the ruler's power and consolidate alliances. In much of the medieval world, rulers were not only political leaders but also presented themselves as religious leaders, or, at the very least, as figures directly blessed by divine forces. A classic example of this is the Byzantine Empire, where the emperor was seen as God's representative on earth. The close alliance between the Orthodox Church and the imperial throne allowed the emperor to use religion to legitimize wars and diplomatic alliances. This fusion of political and religious power meant that imperial decisions often had a sacred character. Wars against the empire's enemies, for example, were often portrayed as holy wars with divine approval. Religious wars and alliances. Religious alliances also played a vital role in the formation and dissolution of imperial cities. In many cases, alliances were based on religious affinities. The Holy Roman Empire, for example, often made alliances with other Christian kingdoms to fight external enemies, such as the Ottomans. These alliances were seen as a way of protecting and expanding the Christian faith. On the other hand, wars between rival religious factions could weaken imperial cities and divide populations. The Crusades are a classic example of how religious faith was used to justify conflicts and military alliances. During the Crusades, cities like Jerusalem changed hands several times as Christian and Muslim armies fought for control of sacred territories. Religious syncretism. Despite conflicts, contact between different religions often led to syncretism, the blending of beliefs and practices from different religious traditions. In multicultural imperial cities such as Baghdad and Cordoba, the coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews resulted in an exchange of religious and philosophical ideas. These imperial centers were, in many cases, more tolerant of other religions than the more homogeneous societies of Europe. This coexistence, however, was fragile. When diplomatic alliances broke down, minority communities often faced religious persecution. The decline of the Abbasid Caliphate, for example, led to the deterioration of relations between religious communities in Baghdad, resulting in an increasingly hostile environment for Christians and Jews. Religious movements and revolts, wars, and alliances could also trigger religious movements that challenged the status quo. Minority religious groups, or even dissident sects within major religions, used political and military tensions to claim greater freedom or influence. The Protestant Reformation, which began as a critique of the consolidated power of the Catholic Church, resulted in a series of conflicts that changed the course of European history and the fate of many imperial cities. The Hussite Revolt in Bohemia, for example, was a religious movement that had far-reaching political repercussions, creating a division within the Holy Roman Empire and influencing future religious wars in Europe. Monumental architecture and urbanization. One of the most visible aspects of the rise of imperial cities through wars and alliances was the transformation of the urban environment. Monumental architecture played a fundamental role in consolidating power and creating a collective identity. Monuments as symbols of power. The construction of imposing monuments was a way for rulers to celebrate their military victories and political alliances. Many imperial cities stood out for the grandeur of their fortifications, palaces, and temples, which symbolized both military power and the ruler's benevolence. In Constantinople, for example, the Hippodrome was a symbol of power and prestige, where great festivities and games were held to exalt the glory of the empire. The emperor himself often participated in these events, showing his connection to the people and his ability to ensure the city's security and prosperity. Likewise, the Hagia Sophia, with its massive dome, was not just an architectural landmark. It was also a symbol of the divine power of the Byzantine emperor. Its construction was made possible by the wealth accumulated by the empire, often through military conquests and diplomatic alliances that secured taxes and taxes. Fortifications and urban defense constant wars also led to the construction of massive fortifications in many imperial cities. These fortifications not only protected the city from external attacks, but also represented the empire's military capability. The walls of Constantinople, with their multiple layers of defense, are a classic example of how an imperial city could prepare to withstand sieges for years. In Carcassonne, France, the medieval city was surrounded by a complex fortress, reinforced by towers and walls that protected it from attacks. These fortress cities were built to withstand invasions and to symbolize the impenetrable power of the kingdom or empire. Urbanization and territorial expansion, successful diplomatic alliances often allowed imperial cities to expand their borders and integrate new regions into their territories. Urbanization was a growing phenomenon as these cities became the center of trade and diplomatic routes. Rulers invested in infrastructure to accommodate the growing population, building markets, aqueducts, and roads that connected the city to the rest of the empire. Rome, during the Roman Empire, was an excellent example of how urbanization was closely linked to imperial expansion. The city was the center of a vast road system that connected all regions of the empire. Each new conquered or allied province was integrated into the empire through these infrastructures, creating a system of connected cities that facilitated trade and military control. On the other hand, cities like Venice had to deal with the challenge of growing in geographically limited areas. The city, built on a series of islands, relied on its commercial alliances to survive and grow. Territorial expansion was limited, but the city expanded in other ways, investing in port infrastructure, canals, and merchant ships to maintain its position of power in the Mediterranean. Long-term consequences. The legacy of imperial cities, the consequences of wars and alliances were not limited to the medieval period. Many of the imperial cities that flourished during this time left a deep and lasting legacy that continued to influence politics, culture, and society long after their fall. Architectural legacy. Many of the imperial cities left an architectural legacy that can still be seen today. Cities like Constantinople, now Istanbul, Rome, Venice, and Baghdad continue to display monuments and structures dating back to their imperial glory days. These monuments not only represent the history of these cities, but also continue to attract tourists and scholars seeking to understand the past. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, built during the Umayyad Caliphate, remains a symbol of Jerusalem's religious and political importance in the Islamic world. Similarly, St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, built on the foundations of Imperial Rome, continues to be a symbol of the Catholic Church's power and influence. Cultural and intellectual legacy. The cultural achievements of imperial cities also survive the test of time. Centers such as Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age and Florence during the Renaissance were cradles of scientific, artistic, and philosophical advances. Many of the ideas developed in these cities continued to influence Western and Eastern thought. The preservation of Greek and Roman knowledge by Muslim scholars in cities such as Cordoba and Baghdad was crucial for the development of science and philosophy in medieval and Renaissance Europe. Without these imperial cities and their commercial and intellectual alliances, many of the ideas that shaped the modern world might have been lost. Geopolitical influences. Finally, many of the alliances and borders established during the period of imperial cities continued to influence modern geopolitics. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire, for example, resulted in the creation of many modern Middle Eastern states, whose borders and conflicts can be traced back to ancient alliances and wars. Similarly, the expansion of the British Empire and other European colonial powers in the early modern era was influenced by the traditions and diplomatic and military strategies inherited from their imperial predecessors. The rise of imperial cities through wars and alliances was much more than just a power game between rulers. These dynamics profoundly shaped the social, cultural, and religious life of populations, leaving a lasting impact that continues to influence the world today. From monumental architecture to the flourishing of arts and sciences, imperial cities left us a legacy that can still be seen and felt around the world. We hope this video has provided a new perspective on imperial cities, going beyond wars and alliances to explore how these events shape people's lives and the cultures they lived in. The history of these cities is rich and complex, and it continues to teach us important lessons about power, cooperation, and conflict.